So, Scott, I can't thank you enough for coming on my show, Chaplin Talks.
Oh, I would. I'd love. It's an honor. Are you kidding?
So, obviously, I first heard about you a while ago when I first contacted you because you wrote this great book called Chaplin versus America. Just quickly, just so people know, give them a little bit about your background because you've written biographies or books about other stars as well, not just my grandfather.
Right. Well, this is my 16th or 17th book. I've
Oh,
been at
wow.
this. I've been down in the coal mines for some time, decades and decades, actually. So basically, I write about, quote, the golden age of Hollywood, unquote, which is an oversimplification because it wasn't all golden, God knows. And I'm generally drawn to people through professional admiration. There are writers who write about subjects, the biographical subjects that they don't actually admire. I'm not one of them. There are writers who would spend 15 years writing a book about Joseph Goebbels. I'm not one of those people.
Okay.
All my books begin with professional admiration. Now, along the way, you can hit some speed bumps.
Yeah.
I've written a couple books where I started out liking the person and ended up not liking the person so much.
Oh, really?
That happens. That happens. Because it's a relationship. It's a relationship. One of you is alive, and one of you, generally speaking, is not alive.
Yeah.
But it's still a relationship. And the more you find out about people, it can be sometimes disconcerting.
Yeah, of course.
But it's a voyage of inquiry. It's a voyage of narration. It's a voyage because life as you live it doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Day by day, week by week, year by year. There's a certain amount of chaos built into everybody's life where you're just reacting to circumstances. And the job of a biographer, it seems to me, is to find the narrative underneath the everyday confusion and chaos, the actual narrative by which people define their lives and live their lives.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my goal when I start out on a book.
Okay, I see. And so when you choose to do a book on my grandfather, I mean, there's so much stuff already out there that's been published about him. Is it difficult to find an angle of how what you're going to write your book about?
Well, in a sense, it was a pandemic book.
Okay.
I had just finished a book that I had shipped off at the beginning of 2020, and things were starting to get a little hairy and closed down. And we're now talking like March of 2020. And we didn't know how long it was going to take, whether this was going to be 6 months or 5 years or whatever. So I'm looking at, generally I take time off between projects just to let the batteries recharge. But as I've gotten older, I take off less time because I'm more conscious of I have a limited amount of time left to write books, And I was thinking, well, maybe I should write something, but what am I going to do if all the libraries are closed? Because given the period I write about, libraries are crucial to me because there are fewer and fewer live people to talk to.
Yes.
Essentially, from that period. So I began to think, well, what can I do where the libraries aren't necessary? And I remembered that the Chaplin archives had been digitized, and a light bulb went on over my head.
And so what type of stuff do you find in the archives?
Was he a capitalist or was he not a capitalist? So I went looking for his stock portfolio, and to my shock, I found his stock portfolio at the time he was kicked out of the country.
Okay, so we just got to the part where, so I was asking you, so you found his stock portfolio in the archives.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Which you said you were very surprised about. So what sort of stuff was he investing in?
Wall Street blue chips.
Okay.
He had basically the same portfolio a conservative Wall Street Republican would have.
Okay.
He was not investing as a radical socialist. He was investing as a Wall Street Republican.
Yeah.
Which just delighted me no end, and actually still delights me. I just find that delicious.
Yeah, I don't know. That's so funny.
His portfolio would not have been radically different than J. Edgar Hoover's.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He had United States savings bonds. He had tobacco stocks. He had Paramount Theater stocks. That was actually the only bad investment he had, the bad stock he had, because in 1952, you didn't want to invest in theaters, movie theaters, because the movie theater business was beginning to crater because of television cutting up success. So the theater business was in decline at that point, and theaters were closing.
Oh, I see.
So that was actually the only stock he had that was dodgy at all, that was not just a pure blue chip. It was a very conservative portfolio.
Yeah, yeah. My grandfather's relationship with America is definitely a tumultuous. It was a journey and a half, I guess, for him. But like, I mean, people say that that it started to go sour when, maybe during the Second World War, just before the Second World War. My grandfather kind of was speaking at Russian rallies I think it was for a second front of some sort. Would you agree that's when it started? That's when things started to go wrong, so to speak, for my grandfather?
Well, there'd always been this kind of niggling undercurrent about that he wasn't necessarily a rah-rah, yay, America personality from the very beginning. I mean, in 1922, before the FBI was the FBI, they had opened a file on him because he'd been attending socialist meetings in New York, in Los Angeles with a friend or two. But again, nothing really the temperature never got tropical until the late 1930s. And I think The Great Dictator actually was the beginning, because The Great Dictator is the classic example of premature anti-fascism.
Yeah.
Because he starts shooting that picture at the end of 1939. It comes out at the end of 1940. And America is an isolationist country. In this period, pronounced isolationist. The Jews were not our problem. Hitler was not our problem. The general theory was that espoused by Joseph Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK. If Hitler took England, we would just make a separate piece and go on about our lives. Period. It was that simple.
Yeah.
And Chaplin is over here putting up his own money and staking his public persona on the fact that no, these people are mad dogs. They have to be fought and they have to be defeated, and that Western civilization depends upon their being defeated. And this was a minority viewpoint in 1940, and it remained a minority viewpoint in America until Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor is not until December of 1941.
Yes.
So he's antagonizing the entire right wing of America, and a great many of the general population who were subscribing to this basically out of don't bother us, we don't want to know about Hitler and about Europe. So he's antagonizing them. And the fact that right after Pearl Harbor, is 4 or 5 months after Pearl Harbor, he begins proselytizing for opening a second front to Russia at a time when nobody really trusted Russia.
Yeah.
Let's face it, only exacerbated that feeling. And that combination began to turn the tide against him. And then came the Joan Barry case, which enabled the FBI and gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Westbrook Pegler and Ed Sullivan to really, really begin a campaign of disinformation.
Yes. So I was going to say, so there's this campaign of disinformation. I guess the FBI at the time, it's almost like they're feeding these stories, some true, some not so true, to the media to try and change the public's perception of my grandfather. Do you have any favorite, or did you find any like stories that were not true that had been fed to the news outlets?
They came in waves. The FBI, typically the FBI would launch. Hoover was intermittently obsessive on the subject of Charlie Chaplin. He would instruct the all this came through the Los Angeles office of the FBI, which is run by a guy who is very well connected within the movie industry. His main contact within the movie industry, his name was Richard something. His main contact within the movie industry was Cecil B. DeMille, who was quite a conservative Republican. And DeMille, of course, had been Mr. Hollywood since 1913 when he arrived there, the same year Chaplin arrived there.
Yes.
And DeMille knew everything that was going on because he had people all over. Everybody had worked with DeMille at one point or another. So he was the conduit through which a lot of information flowed to the FBI. And DeMille knew Chaplin wasn't a communist, and he basically told him he wasn't a communist, and he was an artist. But that was part of the disinformation campaign, you know, that maybe he wasn't really a serious artist. And DeMille told the FBI, yeah, he is an artist. He said he's not particularly well liked, okay, because he was regarded as standoffish and arrogant.
Yeah.
Because nobody in Hollywood is arrogant, of course.
Yeah.
but Chaplin was standoffish. He didn't mingle. He stayed within the confines of his studio in La Brea. You know, he wasn't seen a lot at parties. He had a limited group of intimate friends, and he wasn't out and about doing nightclubs and glad handing.
No,
you know?
not at all. Not at all. Also,
at all.
I was going to say as well, he when he was working, you know, and he was,
oh yeah,
you know, he was working. He had no distractions, whatever. It was when kind of in between films, I think his personal life kind of got in the news, and he was up to certain things.
Exactly. But and then the FBI Los Angeles office would do a pro forma investigation, and they come back and say, well, there's this, and this, but there's no evidence of anything, you know, actionable. And then it would go away for 7 months or 9 months or a year. And then Hoover would suddenly slap his forehead and go, oh, Charlie Chaplin. And then go back to the LA office and say, I want more information about Charlie Chaplin. So he was intermittently obsessive on the subject.
I see what you mean. Okay.
And this went on for years. It went on after the Joan Barry case was finally adjudicated. It went on after Chaplin married your grandmother, and the family started expanding rapidly. It just kept going. And nothing that Chaplin could say or do would alter anybody's mind. And then he made Monsieur Verdoux, which basically was the wrong movie at the wrong time for the wrong audience. You know, a movie about a bitter, misanthropic guy who murders women is not probably the movie he should have made in 1947, coming after 7 years of consistently negative publicity, you know?
Yeah. Would you agree that he's maybe the first sort of superstar or person to kind of go through what you would call cancel culture now? Or is there someone?
Well, yeah, because there was a political basis to it, and there was a sexual basis to it, and that's a deadly combination, because they're essentially mutually exclusive audiences. There are those people who basically think strictly in political terms, and then there are those people who are obsessed with sex, you know. And Chaplin had done the twofer, you know. He'd had the Russia thing, and then he'd had the Joan Barry case, and then came Monsieur Verdoux, which seemed to confirm a lot of the biases that the right wing had accused him of during World War II.
Yeah.
Misanthropic, misogynistic, blah, 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 blah. Because they conflated the character with the actor playing the character.
Yeah, exactly.
And as if it was a one-to-one corollary. You know?
Yeah. And so just to backtrack a little bit, Joan Barry, explain, so she was definitely a character. So explain maybe how they met, and then we'll get into maybe the case a little bit, because that's a very interesting part of his life for sure.
It is an interesting part of his life. He was between pictures. The Great Dictator had come out, had been a great success, which meant he wasn't doing anything. He was idly working on the revision of the Gold Rush that came out in 1942.
Yes.
She had been the mistress of J. Paul Getty, famous American eccentric oil millionaire in Oklahoma. She thought it would be fun to be in the movie business. So she got a letter of introduction, went to California, and began making the route of parties and nightclubs. She met Chaplin. He and Paula Goddard had broken up right after The Great Dictator came out. Basically, The Great Dictator was made at a time when they were breaking up. The relationship was beginning to falter. So as soon as the picture was over, they were over. So he was between relationships. One thing led to another. They became a couple. They were together for maybe a year, tops.
Yeah.
It was a turbulent relationship. She went away for a while. She went back to Getty for a while, then came back to Los Angeles, and then went away and came back, and then announced she was pregnant. Chaplin did the math and realized he couldn't have been the father. She was adamant that he was the father. He refused to settle. She went to Hedda Hopper. Hedda Hopper went to the FBI, and the storm was on.
Yes.
Her testimony to the FBI mostly is in the book. They had their hands full with her. She had a drinking problem. She and her mother had a very violent relationship, emotionally violent relationship. They didn't get along. She was constantly getting drunk, and the FBI didn't know how to handle her. They knew she was basically an unreliable witness, but she was the best witness they had.
Yeah.
So he was prosecuted first on the Mann Act, which was transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. Which is
at the time, was it not kind of like this really silly kind of?
It was archaic at the time. The Mann Act was archaic at the time, because it's not like nobody in Hollywood had been transporting women to outside of California to spend a weekend. You know, this has been going on forever. But it was on the books, and he and she had traveled to New York on several occasions. So he was prosecuted. Well, the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for an hour and found him innocent. And then came the paternity suit. By this time, she'd had the child. It was a daughter. Chaplin willingly took a blood test. The blood test proved he was not the father.
Yes.
He went to trial, and he lost anyway, because at that point in California, a blood test was not all by itself dispositive in a paternity case. So he appealed. His appeal was denied. So he had to pay child support for the next 18 years for a child that wasn't his. So it was a gross miscarriage of justice, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it.
Yeah.
Basically.
And I mean, he
got railroaded. He got railroaded because of this groundswell of negative publicity. And as the paternity trial was getting underway, he had married your grandmother, who was 18 years old at that time.
At the time, exactly.
Now, the marriage, of course, turned out to be a complete success. But at the time, here he is. He's 52 or 53. His hair is white, so he looked at least 10 to 15 years older than he was.
Yes.
He's just married an 18-year-old, which seemed to be prima facie evidence that all the things that were being said about him were true or partially true. So that didn't help either at the time.
Yeah.
It was his salvation. The marriage turned out to be his salvation.
For sure.
But at the time, it did not do him any good in the court of public opinion or in the court of the California paternity suit.
Yeah, for sure. And as well, I mean, Joan Barry, she broke into his house, didn't she? She smashed the window, broke into his house.
Yes. And everything. Yes, it was Christmas. It was, I believe, December 23rd or the 24th, Christmas Eve. And she broke into his house, and she had a gun.
Yeah.
And she was very erratic, to say the least. After the trial, he was found guilty of fathering the child. She had a very turbulent life. She lived in Mexico for a while. She spent 10 years in a California mental institution, after which she came out and lived a quiet life. She had several more children with a man she married. He worked on a railroad. She died in the early 2000s.
Yeah. I don't know. Have you watched many documentaries about my grandfather? There was...
Sure, I've watched all of them.
Okay, so there was one that came out not too long ago called The Real Charlie Chaplin. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I saw it.
So the whole Joan Barry thing is kind of interesting, because they mention Joan Barry, but they don't really mention any of the other... Because obviously they tried to focus the documentary on how he was maybe hard to work with, how he could be stubborn, which I'm sure he was, all that kind of stuff. But with the whole Joan Barry thing, they kind of skip over the fact that she broke into his house, that he paid for a child that wasn't his. and kind of made it seem like the reason she ended up in a mental institution was because my grandfather was sort of abusive to her. So
she had a lot of problems before she met your
oh, for
grandfather.
sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Now, I'm sure the entire experience of being turned into a puppet for the FBI's political bias against Chaplin did her no good.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, there's some letters I quoted in the book that I found in the Chaplin archive that she wrote to, I believe, Neil McCarthy, your father's lawyer at the time, grandfather's lawyer at the time, from Mexico. This is in the late 1940s now, basically recanting her testimony at the trial.
Yes.
And accusing the FBI of fomenting the entire case and putting words in her mouth and taking advantage of her. She goes a little vague on the subject, taking advantage of what she implies was her innocence. I'm not sure she was actually innocent, but she wanted to take that role. But essentially, she does a 180 in these letters to Neil McCarthy.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I quote the letters in the book. And of course, these letters were not disseminated at the time. They were kept private, you know, because it wouldn't have done Chaplin any good to bring up Joan Barry in 1946, 47, 48, because at that point, he was faced with a tidal wave of negative publicity. That's when things really ramped up, is after the war, because then the blacklist era starts in Hollywood and spreads to Washington.
Yes. Okay.
And at that point, he's really playing defense all the time.
Yeah. The lengths that they went to kind of get information on my grandfather. I mean, there'd be people outside his house. I think his phones were tapped even. You know, this is
it was a full court press. They at one time or another, the FBI was surveilling his house. They were opening his mail. Yeah. The IRS audited his taxes, both corporate and personal. His friends were interviewed. His employees were interviewed. Oh, you mentioned lunatic stories. There are two I'm particularly fond of. The one, this happened right after the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for spying for Russia. This is in the early 1950s. Yeah. Just about the time he was being driven out of the country, where a story was printed that he was going to adopt the children of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who had just been put to death. Like he didn't have enough children at this point. I mean, just pure lunacy that no one who wasn't an obsessive on the subject of communism or Charles Chaplin could possibly take seriously. Things like that, you know. But some really lunatic stories were printed. Another one was that he was conspiring with the Haganah to murder British soldiers in Palestine. The Haganah was the terrorist wing advocating for a Jewish state, you know, which they eventually got, and that he was somehow involved with the Haganah in the murder of British soldiers who were occupying what became Israel at the point. Yeah. So there were really lunatic stories being printed. And his basic position about these kinds of stories was to ignore them.
Yes.
He simply couldn't respond to everything, because by responding, you just keep the story alive for 3 more days. Yeah. 4 more days. You know? So generally speaking, he ignored these kinds of stories. He did respond to the story about adopting the children of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and said it was crazy, just absolutely crazy. But not that that didn't help any, you know. The story still got printed.
I mean, he did hold a press conference as well at one point when he was under scrutiny, where I think they were asking, you know, everyone in the press conference were asking him about his tax affairs and why he's not paying tax.
Yes, that was the press conference for the opening of Monsieur Verdoux. Yeah. In April of 1947.
Yeah. You know, and he had some...
And the VFW was there, Veterans of Foreign Wars. Okay. And the American Legion were there, and they started pelting him with questions about why he never became a citizen. Yeah. And that's the things like that. Yeah. And he tried to explain that, you know, he didn't regard himself, that his sons, Charlie Jr. and Sidney, had both served in World War II, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. and did no good, whatever, because they weren't really interested in a back and forth. They were interested in making him look guilty.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And the funny thing is, as well, J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, didn't he have some questionable sexual encounters as well himself?
Well, he lived with Clyde Tolson, the assistant director of the FBI. They were in Washington. They were regarded as a couple,
Okay.
But Hoover surrounded himself. Hoover adopted this carapace of bulldog masculinity. He even looked like a bulldog, actually. And he had this carapace of bulldog masculinity, and he was always very interested in other people's perceived sexual Baroque habits.
Yes.
For instance, in the FBI file on Chaplin, there's a long section with Tim Durant, who was a close friend of your grandfather's for some years. And Tim Durant was having an affair with Catherine Dunham, a black dancer, a well-known black dancer, period. And this point is made once or twice specifically for Hoover's eyes, because Tim Durant's sexual relationships have nothing to do with what he was being asked about. They were asking Tim Durant about your grandfather's sexual relationships with Joan Barry, but they were informing Hoover that Durant was outre in that he was having a relationship with a black woman.
Yeah.
A well-known black theatrical personage.
Yeah.
Because they knew that would pique his interest. They were catering to his own perversity is not the word I would use. But they were catering to what they knew was his prejudice, shall we say.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. I mean, I can't imagine being around in that time. It must be great. I guess where my grandfather was very, very smart is, he financed most of his own films, especially the later very political ones. He just financed himself. So no one could really control him. So it just shows what kind of personality.
There was a lot of people didn't want the great dictator. A lot of people in Hollywood thought he was crazy to make The Great Dictator because it was an overtly anti-fascist film, and he was going to be doing a parody of Hitler, satire of Hitler. And he'd been financing his own film since 1918. He just cut a check, and he owned the films outright, but that wasn't really, I don't think, the main reason he did it. The main reason he did it was to maintain his autonomy, which psychologically was crucial to him, because his entire childhood was one of being where he had no autonomy, whatever. He was constantly being buffeted about by his father's alcoholism or his mother's mental illness, or by circumstance, and he was having to adjust. So as an adult, once he got a certain amount of leverage in terms of his career, autonomy became the means by which he could function most effectively and build a structure around which, within which he could function. He didn't want to be buffeted by anybody else's opinions. He didn't trust anybody else's opinions, I don't think. I think he trusted himself and maybe two or three other people in his entire life. I think he trusted your grandmother. I think he trusted Douglas Fairbanks.
Yeah, for sure. Sidney.
And that might be it. That might actually be it, those two people.
Yeah, well, Sidney, his brother as well.
Died young.
Yeah, for sure. Where do you think he got his business sense from?
I think Sidney had a great deal to do with it. Because look, Sidney's career ends in 1928, 1929, and Sidney lived in the south of France for the rest of his life.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. In a caravan.
So I don't know where Sidney's money was coming from. I don't think Jack Warner was paying him enough money in those 4 or 5 years he was working for Jack Warner.
Yeah.
I don't know where Sidney's money was coming from, but it was coming from someplace. Sidney lived very comfortably. So I think a lot of it came from Sidney, and a lot of it came from fear, because he didn't always know where he wanted to go, but he knew he didn't want to end up like his father. He didn't want to end up like his mother. He didn't want to end up as a ward of the state.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to end up as an alcoholic. So drinking was almost, a glass of wine or something at dinner. That was it. And he kept himself rigidly defined by control of his studio. And that wasn't even enough. Then he owns 25% of a major releasing organization, United Artists. So he set up a corporation, you know, to apart from his own structure. He set up the Charles Chaplin Film Corporation.
Yes.
Okay, so he's getting and also there's good lawyers in Los Angeles by this time.
Yeah.
You know, because the movie industry needed good lawyers. And so there were a lot of good lawyers, and he had good taste in lawyers. He had Neil McCarthy for years. And McCarthy was Cecil B. DeMille's lawyer, for instance.
Okay.
Politics didn't enter into it. You know, DeMille was an extraordinary businessman. The DeMille estate still coins money off of the Ten Commandments and Samson and Delilah. These films don't go away.
Yes.
You know, they're run all the time. And I know because I wrote a big book about DeMille some years back. And DeMille's sense of control of his own career and his sense of how it's all predicated upon autonomy and success at the box office. Yes. And once DeMille found his groove commercially, he never really deviated from it. And your grandfather only deviated from it when he gave up the tramp character after Modern Times, you know?
Yes.
And that actually is, I wish I would have loved to have asked him point blank, why did you stop? Now, the Jewish barber in The Great Dictator is kind of like the tramp, but he's kind of not. He looks like the tramp. But he's far more, he looks like the tramp. He dresses like the tramp, but he's much more passive than the tramp ever was. You know, he's very passive as a human being until the speech at the end. But then that's Chaplin stepping out of the character and talking as Chaplin. I don't think he's talking as the Jewish barber. I think that's Charlie Chaplin talking as Charlie Chaplin.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, completely.
But the character that he plays throughout the picture is much gentler and more recessive and more passive than the tramp would ever have been in those same circumstances. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know?
For sure. I mean, that's got to do with, I guess, my grandfather not wanting to give the tramp a voice, like he said. He reached millions and millions of people. If he gave him a voice, I guess it would ruin the character in a way.
Sure, because as soon as he opens his mouth, he's English.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's too much of an identity. The part of the charm of the tramp was that everybody saw him as their cousin. The French saw him as French. The Germans saw him as German before Hitler. The Japanese could see him as Japanese, and Americans could see him as American, even though the character, to me, is essentially a British character. The dignified poverty thing, you know, the Dickensian wanderer thing. It's essentially an English character more than it's an American character.
For sure.
But because of the way he played him and because of the elegance and the genius with which he played him, the character was universally accepted as a kind of avatar of humanity.
The talkies came out. I guess he had to move on. I mean, all the greatest artists of our time, all the ones that have longevity have all changed their image and all changed, whether it's bands, they've changed styles of music over the years. And I guess he just kind of did that. But he also kind of had no choice, I guess. Well,
he did change. I mean, after Modern Times, he does abandon the tramp. The Great Dictator is a one-off because that was, if Hitler hadn't existed, he wouldn't have made The Great Dictator. You know? Yeah. And then he reinvents himself by playing these two extremely disparate characters, Verdu, and then 5 years later he plays Calvero. You know, well, there's no overlap between those two people.
No.
So he's kind of, after he abandons the tramp, he's kind of in the position of a typical actor, except he's writing his own parts. But he's still looking for different aspects of his personality to illuminate.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You know, and you could, every once in a while you'll see a little bit of the tramp in Verdu. There's a moment or two in Verdu where you see a glimpse of the tramp, I think.
Yeah.
Calvero, not so much.
Yeah, yeah. He would have probably stayed in America if none of this, you know, if his visa hadn't got revoked and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind he never would have left America.
Yeah.
He never would have left America. This is a guy who lived in one house in America for 30 years.
Yeah.
For 30 years. Now, the interesting thing, you'll be interested in this is something that's not in the book. Every time a book comes out, someone calls you and gives you wonderful stuff that you didn't know existed.
Mm-hmm.
When this book came out a few months ago, I got a call from Catherine Weiler, the daughter of William Wyler.
Okay.
And she said, and she introduced herself. She said, I want you to know I am the last survivor of the Chaplin Weiler tennis tournaments. And she went on to tell me this story because Weiler lived there. David Selznick lived slightly above Chaplin, and there was Chaplin, and then Weiler lived just below Chaplin in Summit Drive. And Chaplin, of course, had a tennis court. And she said, Charlie and my dad would play tennis for hours. And she said, and we would all sit and watch the Chaplin kids and Una and my mother and the Weiler kids. We would all sit and watch. And she said, I want to tell you, they played for blood. These are two little men, Chaplin and Weiler, and they went at it like they were fighting over France, you know? I mean, it was lethal. Neither one would give an inch. Neither one would capitulate. She said it was to the death. It was to the death. And they weren't laughing. It wasn't fun. They were playing to destroy. So finally, when they were exhausted and it was over, she said Una and her mom, Tally Weiler. Tally Weiler was wonderful, by the way. I knew her. Una and Tally would play, and neither one of them could play tennis. She said, and the kids would get bored and throw things at their mothers because they had none of the athletic expertise that their fathers did, you know,
Okay.
and they just gave them a hard time. And after a while, the wives would stop playing because it wasn't fun because the kids were yelling things at them and Mom, you're embarrassing us, you know, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's so funny.
So that came from Catherine Weiler and if I'd known that story, I would have put it in the book.
Yeah.
Because there's that whole section from Norman Lloyd, who was a friend of mine, talking about playing tennis with Charlie and how that was his main physical activity, you know, in this period, World War II and right after the war.
Yeah.
It was his great passion.
Yeah, that's hilarious. I grew up in the house in Switzerland where he lived. I was born.
Sure.
And then we eventually moved in when my grandparents passed away. And there was a tennis court there, and they had all his old tennis rackets in. So they had all these old style tennis rackets, you know, the really long wooden ones. So which was really cool. And I heard so many stories about how he loved to play tennis. But Catherine
Weiler said he was a very, and Norman said the same thing. He's a very good tennis player. He was fast. He was light. He could move. And he never lost track of the score, ever. He always knew the score. Yeah.
How funny.
But you could beat him because he was too vain to wear glasses on the court.
Okay.
He wouldn't wear his glasses on the court. So if you could work the corners, you could get an advantage on it.
Yeah. And so I was listening to other interviews you did just to kind of do research for, you know, before I spoke to you. And so you were saying, which I didn't know, is if my grandfather decided to appeal the decision to go back to America, they would have had to have let him back into the country.
They would have had to let him back in. Absolutely. They would have. They had nothing on him. He'd never been convicted of a misdemeanor, let alone a felony.
Yeah.
So they had absolutely no grounds to kick him out of the country, to rescind his reentry permit. But I'm not sure he knew that. What I do know is he was absolutely outraged. He was furious beyond furious.
Yeah.
And even if it had been explained to him, you know, you could appeal this, go back and appeal this. But that way, I think he would have felt he would have been having to deal with people he despised, you know, and his temperament made it more likely to walk away, easier to walk away. Yeah. And also, basically, fuck you.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I should, after you've done this to me, I should come back and ask you to let me back in the country. He'd been disinvited from the party. Yeah. Why would you want to go back to the party?
Also, wasn't there this whole thing that if he did want to re-enter, that he would have to face a board of questioning? So people would ask him a bunch of questions.
Oh, sure. He would have had to go through it, but ultimately they would have had to let him in the country.
Yeah.
But I just don't think he could have dealt that. He'd been autonomous for so long. that to be rejected by a country he regarded as his own adopted country meant to him he'd have to find another adopted country.
Yeah, for sure. And in a way,
and he did, and he did,
and he absolutely did. And in a way, I think those later years in Switzerland were probably some of the best in his life, in the sense that it was a much more peaceful life. He was with a wife that he loved very much. He had his family, so in a way, he became way more of a family man, away from the limelight, you know. So it's this whole other aspect, and as well, cinema by then changed so much from when he started making films. It completely evolved, you know. So, you know, maybe it was in a way it was a good thing for him.
Well, it was certainly more positive emotionally for him, I'm sure. You know, creatively, I can't claim that King of New York and Comes from Hong Kong are anywhere near the level of the films he'd been making before in America.
Yeah.
As I write in the book, you know, if you're living in New York or LA or Paris or Madrid, you're abraded in very interesting ways every day, and sometimes it's very annoying, and sometimes it's even destructive. But it's alive. There's ferment. There's activity. There's intellectual, political, social activity all around you. You can't not notice it, and all that works to the advantage of a creative artist. And in Switzerland, it's very quiet.
Yeah, for sure.
All the time, it's very quiet. That's why people come to Switzerland.
Yeah.
But the downside to that is you don't have that sense of social ferment that makes artists work.
Yeah.
You know, that gives them things to talk about and write about and make movies about.
Yeah. I mean, I think suddenly he was also forced, those later years, was kind of forced to work with film studios. So when he wanted to make some of these films, he had to go suddenly team up with people, which he wasn't very used to. He wasn't used to having other people having input.
More expensive. Yeah. It was hard for him to make a movie for, you know, $1 million anymore. That was just impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, King of New York wasn't terribly expensive. But after that, the costs kept rising, and he was, I think, fair to say, slightly nervous about money. You know, as many people who are born and raised poor always are, and it doesn't matter how much their savings account shows when they look at their net worth. They always feel potentially endangered. You know, so it wasn't, he was going, it's one thing to write a check for $1 million, as he was used to writing, to make a movie, to make Limelight or Verdú or Great Dictator. All those pictures cost $1 million, give or take. But to write a check for $4 or $5 or $6 million, that's a whole different issue.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think the American government would have, you know, if this whole thing happened now in today's world? Do you think? How do you think the American government would have dealt with it? Because I mean, nowadays you don't hear of anyone being kicked out of a country.
No, but they can be effectively disenfranchised, creatively disenfranchised.
With
just as
social
your
media.
Grandfather was creatively disenfranchised. The audience rejected Verdú. Decisively in America, decisively reject. The reviews were terrible, and nobody went.
And it's a great movie.
It's a very good movie. It's a very good movie. It's probably not the movie people wanted to see him do.
Yeah,
you know, it's more interesting now. Then it was just a kind of semi-outrage, but not enough people saw it to be really outraged. You know, it was New York saw it and they rejected it, and nobody went to see it in the other parts of the country. And UA basically said, sorry, you know, and UA was having terrible troubles at this point anyway.
Yes.
But I don't think any company could have effectively distributed Monsieur Verdú in 1947. It simply was not the movie people wanted to see. It just wasn't. People wanted to see Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House.
Yeah.
Okay. And I like Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, but it's not. Those two movies exist in separate universes.
Yeah. I see what you mean. And like you were saying about Limelight as well. I mean, at least there you get to see Buster Keaton and my grandfather work together, which is.
Oh, I love Limelight. I think Limelight's actually a much better movie than Monsieur Verdú.
Okay.
I love Limelight.
Yeah, it's such
I think
a
it's a beautiful picture, and I think it's a summation of his life and his idea of his own life's meaning.
exactly. And okay, so how do you think Hollywood has changed over time since since what you'd call the golden age, or since my grandfather's time? It's changed a lot, obviously. Has it changed for the worst?
Well, yes and no. It's easier for artists to work, but nobody writes. I mean, Christopher Nolan doesn't write a check to finance his own movies.
Mm-hmm.
Stanley Kubrick used studio money. You know,
Mm-hmm.
directors. There are directors who work with complete autonomy, but they take the studio money. You know, and they finesse the notes. They finesse. There's some back and forth. You know, unless they have contractual final cut.
Mm-hmm.
And probably Nolan does at this point have final cut. And Kubrick had final cut after Clockwork Orange.
Mm-hmm.
But he took the studio money. He always took studio money because he had to self-finance his first couple pictures. Well, it was family money. Kubrick had some family money. His father was a doctor, and he had an uncle that had some cash, and the uncle financed Kubrick's first couple of pictures.
Yeah.
But it was Kubrick was not wealthy, but that's how he got started.
Okay.
But we think of these guys, we think of these directors as godlike figures, remote and autonomous. I think the remoteness is just a way of staying focused. You know, Kubrick with his farm in England. I don't know where Nolan lives, but Nolan, you never hear anything about Nolan except when he's got a film coming out.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
They're not out there doing talk shows,
No,
except that if they got something to sell.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they just disappear, which is smart. You have to save yourself for the work.
Yeah,
which is what your grandfather always did. He saved himself for the work. He wasn't out there giving interviews except when he had something to sell.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's smart. But no, it's completely different because it's completely corporate.
Yeah.
And Hollywood when you're dealing in, let's say, the 1940s, all the people that are running Hollywood in the 1940s were there 25 years earlier when Hollywood was just getting started. Paramount was Lasky. Lasky was gone by this point, but Zucker was there. DeMille was still at Paramount. The Warner Brothers were still at Warner Brothers. So you still had the founding generation running the companies, the studios. Pickford and Chaplin were still kind of running UA in a kind of half-assed fashion,
yes.
because neither one of them was making enough movies to support the company, So we've got nothing to distribute here. Yeah, well, that's your problem. Well, no, actually, it was their problem too. But basically, Hollywood's still being run in the 1940s and into the 50s by the same people that have been running it for the last 35 years.
Yeah.
They began to die out in the 1950s. The Schenck brothers slowly gave up. Louis B. Mayer was deposed at MGM. Jack Warner shafted his own brother, Harry, out of Warner Brothers and ran it by himself for the last 7 or 8 years of his career, sold it in the mid-60s. So the changeover comes in the 50s and 60s when your grandfather's out of the country.
Yeah.
When he's still, up until 1952, basically Hollywood was still Hollywood, the same Hollywood he'd known for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
40 years. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really begin to shift until the late and mid 50s, and then radically in the 60s with the big die-off.
Yeah, okay.
And also the audience begins to change. People stop going to the movies because it's the only activity, the only social activity there was. You could go to a ball game or go bowling or go to a movie. Those were your choices. Mm-hmm. But now, today, there's so many choices, what you can do. You can stare at your phone for 5 hours if that's what you want to do. You could just scroll Facebook or whatever, or TikTok, and the day goes by, Well, that didn't exist until fairly recently. So people don't have to leave their house. No. They can just watch movies on their large screen TV.
Yeah.
And just call stuff on Amazon or Netflix or Hulu or whatever streaming service they subscribe to. So it's a radically 180-degree shift from the world your grandfather lived in.
Yeah.
And he would be stunned and shocked at things like iPhones You
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, look at how much he had fun with the bellows feeding machine in modern
Yeah.
times. You know, kind of lunatic inventions that people could actually come up with, you know, to streamline production. Think what he could have fun with our modern sensibility
Oh, for sure.
about people's insularity and not and refusing to mingle with other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. And what's interesting about the whole streaming thing is that, I mean, people spend hours, even me, I spend hours trying to find something to watch. And when you do eventually watch something, I think to myself, this is not something that I would go and watch in the cinema. I wouldn't pay money to
It's not
go.
something you would pay $10 to see,
No,
10 or
absolutely.
15 bucks to see
Yeah, yeah,
for free. It's not for free because you're paying your monthly, whatever you're
yeah.
paying. But essentially, no, you sit there for 25 minutes and realize, well, this is shit.
Yeah. It's true. It's very true.
You know, and you know, but you've got, in other words, we're adjudicating for the 20 bucks a month it costs me to subscribe to Amazon or Netflix. Okay, and I watch 5 of these things, so I'm paying $4 a piece, which is more than they're worth. But okay, you know, and if you want to see something seriously good, then you ante up the $15 or $20,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and see Oppenheimer or whatever it
Exactly.
might be, you know. So we've got this 2-tier system now of stuff that's made, and occasionally you see something really good on Amazon or Netflix, although not lately. But we've developed a 2-tier system for entertainment, of judging entertainment, and that was not the case. You know, you went to the movies, and often it was a double feature. And if the second feature was usually junky, but the first feature they would be giving it a college
Yeah,
try. You know, to actually be trying to make a good movie,
yeah, yeah.
as opposed to product. You know, but a lot of stuff now is just product, and it's intended to be product, and that's all it's supposed to be. Something to, you know, fill up your time when you're not looking at your phone.
Yeah.
You can look at the screen, then look back at your phone. That's the level of product they're making.
All right. So the book is called Chaplin versus America. You can find it everywhere. You can find it online. I'm sure you can probably go to your local bookshop and find it as well. Thank you so much for coming on. This was very interesting, and I know some people are going to be very interested in this talk we just did.
Well, thank you, Spencer. It's good. It's good that we could meet even through the medium
Exactly.
of the iPad. You know, I appreciate it,
No,
and I hope we can do it again sometime.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Huh?